Hmm.
Highest of highs right now.
Oh, I'm
Just
so
watching
happy.
Colombia.
Yeah. I just got back from Amsterdam. I was watching the game there, and it was all happy people. I almost canceled, but I'm here.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, hopefully we keep the hype going a little bit. Hard to
Yeah, for
without a game,
sure.
but if my goal, and I'll say it when we start recording for the pod, is to make this the business side of everything sound a little more exciting. Like the hot stove season of baseball, off season for football, American football. It's always got this aura of excitement. I feel like it's because people know a lot more about
Yeah,
the different, like there's just more knowledge about the different things. And so I like doing this one. It reminds me of, remember last year when we did that MLS 2.0 episode?
yeah.
It
Yeah,
reminds
it's
me of
kind of
that, but like,
similar.
yeah, similar, but it's like meaningful because we actually, I feel this year is more like we're in it now,
Yeah. It's
right?
just when there are so many rules that are different, it's just so difficult to explain. But hey, I'm
Yeah.
excited. I'm excited about talking about the free agent.
Singular.
we assume. Maybe I'll let you talk about that one. Stu, let me know when
I'll
you're back
try.
and we can start recording.
Oh, I'm back.
Okay. You guys ready?
Yep.
Let's do it.
All right, I'll bring us in. Welcome in, everyone, to Flyover Footy. You're listening to us on the Big 550 KTRS. My name is Matt Baker. I'll be your host this evening, this afternoon, this morning, whenever you're listening to us. And we've got somewhat of a fun episode for you. It is full-on off-season mode here at Flyover Footy, and we've got an off-season preview. The last week, we looked back at the season that was, and this week, we make the shift complete into the off-season, and we look to bring a little of awareness to the MLS off-season with all of its quirks. We're going to dive into all of the calendar of events in the next few weeks ahead of us. We're going to dive into exactly what each one of these processes, each one of these dates mean. Try to give a little bit of a textbook definition, but keep it light, keep it informative, exciting, and make it a little city flair. So in all of this, it kind of can get mundane if you get into the weeds too much, but we're going to keep it light. We're going to keep it interesting. And joining me tonight, I have some of my exciting friends in soccer. I've got Santiago Beltran. I've got Stuart Holgren. Santi, you're riding high this evening as we record, watching your country get a 2-1 win over Brazil, right?
Oh yeah. So happy. First time Colombia beat Brazil in World Cup qualifiers. So yeah, so excited and Luis Diaz scored 2 goals. It's great for him because he had not been scoring with the team, and also just because a few days ago his father was released from being kidnapped.
What an incredible story. I mean, it's got the happy ending you want, but that is so wild.
Yeah, but yeah, very exciting. This is just the beginning of the qualifying process, but just very good for Colombia. So I'm happy.
First of many wins, hopefully.
I hope so.
Stu, how are you doing this evening?
Oh, I'm doing great. I don't think I have quite the excitement of Santi with the U.S. game going on. Last I checked, it was 0-0 against
Uh-oh.
Trinidad. But maybe that's changed in the last few minutes.
Now it's going to go into half nil as we're recording this.
Oh, yep, halftime. But Trinidad and Tobago's on a red card right now. So sorry as a spoiler if someone's saving to watch that match, if you're one of the 24 people who aren't watching it live who are going to watch it later.
If you're listening to this on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and you haven't watched the U.S. game first, let us know, because I would be dying to know if there are people who are listening to Flyover Footy who haven't seen the U.S. game who want to. That would be fascinating to me. But guys, before we get into the off-season calendar of events, there is one little interesting thing that Santi and I were discussing before recording, and I feel it warrants a little bit of discussion. And let's not dive too deep into this, but it speaks for itself in what I'm about to read. Right after the season ended, Lutz Pfannenstiel, our sporting director of St. Louis City, gave his kind of end of season recap, thanking the fans and everything on social media, on all of his platforms. He thanked the fans for their support. He thanked ownership. He called out the City Futures as having served our communities by breaking the pay-to-play model. He thanked City 2, the Academy, producing players for the first team, and the on-field success of City this year. He also said, and this was his quote when he put the post up, saying, quote, "It is important to remember that it is year one of a 5-year plan. The first team is ahead of schedule. We met our objectives, but that is never enough. I want to assure you that we are already working hard on what comes next. We have been planning our offseason for some time. I can promise you we plan to improve the squad, make tweaks to our setup, and come back for next season stronger than ever." Now, reading that, that's how we went into preparing for Flyover, knowing that they were hard at work and we can look forward to a lot of these milestones being met. But then eagle-eyed Santiago Beltran happened to notice that if you look at Facebook right now at the time of recording still says that exact same thing. But if you look at Instagram, there has been an edit made to the verbiage. Instead of listing it as year one of a 5-year plan, on Instagram, as of the time of recording, it reflects year 3 of a 5-year plan. So
Ooh.
the question was, and Stu, I'm going to post this to you because this is brand new information to you. The question is, how much does that change things, knowing that this is what we speculated on, was year one when he was hired back in August of 2020, and so you had 21, 22, now 23, or does year one begin now with the first team? And it seems like the goalpost had shifted back to what we originally thought, and so this being now updated to say year 3, how much do you think this changes things, Stu?
It being year 3 makes sense to me because obviously when the academy started, that was year 1. That was the beginning. That was the nexus point. But that just means that what's the final goal in year 5 is what matters. Is that a MLS Cup championship? Is that CONCACAF Champions Cup championship? Is that just a trophy in general? It compresses the timeline a lot more and perhaps makes next year certainly more important because it's not year 2, it's year 4. So if you don't execute in year 4, then you better dang well execute in year 5. Otherwise, your whole 5-year plan is a failure.
And so, Santi, because you were the one who noticed this, speaking about the goals, how do you think this changes things? If Lutz is saying that we're ahead of schedule by being first place in the West in now year 3, do you think that maybe the end goal of year 5 was MLS Cup or Supporter Shield, and now the timeline is getting moved up a little bit to where that's an attainable goal next year?
Well, hard to know what that goal for GR5 is, but the way I think about it is like, yeah, you get to GR5 and then you have a new 5-year plan. I don't think there is anything to freak about. And after listening to Estudia, it makes sense. You have to count the academy year, CD2 year, that's part of the process. So it makes sense that it's year 3. But yeah, I was thinking about it. I was like, well, yeah, you get to year 5 and then you start a new plan. And yeah, he said the team is ahead of his schedule, which makes me think maybe year 5 it was something like Supporter Shield or qualifying for CONCACAF Champions Cup, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I just don't know if they will recalibrate the goals. Well, you're going to be in CONCACAF Champions League, so
Yeah.
maybe you have to modify the goals because you're going to be in a new competition. But maybe the end, he has always said being competitive, and based on conversations with him, being competitive could be like being in the matches, and even if you lose, it was a competitive match. It could also be top of the table. But yeah, I think there will be some adjustments. It's great to be ahead, but I don't think the team should like get ahead of what the initial goal was. Is continue working on being competitive and basically becoming one of the top teams in the league. And yeah, if it comes with hardware, if the team wins a championship, great. But just continue working towards those initial goals and make a few adjustments. But I think it's sometimes it's easy to get to the top, but what's
Mhm.
difficult is to stay there. So I think the goal now is to become one of those teams that always makes playoffs, is always at the top of the table, and be competitive.
And that's exactly what the entire league is waiting to happen, is for us to have the sophomore slump, to regress, just like everybody thinks we will, with the few holes that, Matt Doyle and them see they've seen in us and have talked about. That's on Lutz to prove them wrong. And now that we're seeing a little bit more of a dose of reality in the concept of this being year 3 of 5, it gets back to our original thought that Lutz, being the most interesting man in soccer, doesn't stay in one place for too long, and likes his opportunities. He can cherry pick essentially where he goes because of his resume. He loves St. Louis. We know he does. He's spoken about it many times, so that's never in question. But knowing that this is a 3 of 5 year plan now, year 3 of 5, kind of gives it a different feel going into this offseason to me. Because if you're ahead of schedule now, no matter what you're working towards as your goal, stretch goal, whatever, for next year, I feel this may give him a little more reason to be aggressive, even more aggressive, to take that next step and to make sure that you're providing the depth that your side is going to need to at least stay where you are at the top of the Western Conference, and work to progress as much as possible, just in MLS play, but in also these other 3 competitions we're going to be in. So I think that's a good point to pivot to the offseason calendar and what we have to look forward to over the next few weeks. But from a city perspective, I was talking to Stu earlier, and guys, this is it's maybe more exciting to me than it was last year, where last year had that new, fresh, shiny feel going into the expansion draft, going into the super draft. And you had these first moments where we're building our team. These are the inaugural players that we're going to get. It garnered us guys like Nico Joachini, Indiana Vasilev, Tim Parker on the expansion draft night. And now we're looking at possibly saying goodbye to some players and leveraging a few of those key MLS moments, the free agencies, the re-entry draft, all of those different things that all of the teams can play a part of. So the question is, or actually the conversation has to start with, which city players' contracts are expiring at the end of this year that will have some kind of announcement made over the next couple of weeks, whether it is an offer made, an option extended, free agency, re-entry draft, or whatnot. And so that list of players who are under contract with City now, whose contracts expire at the end of 2023, are Max Schneider, Owen O'Malley, Jared Stroud, Celio Pompeu, Anthony Marcanic, John Nelson, Josh Yarrow, maybe. We're not quite positive on him. He may have an additional year. Sam Adeniran, AZ Jackson, Akil Watts, John Bell, Lucas Bartlett, and Michael Creek. Everybody else has at least a guaranteed contract through next year. And so a lot of these players, we're not quite sure, do they have an option year? We assume most of them do, because that's how MLS contracts work. But some of them, different ages, different MLS experience, different years of service, are going to fall on this calendar differently. So before we get into the calendar, I'm interested on your guys' takes on just this crop of players. How do you think this overall, like, globally impacts the club, with this group being the ones in question and the rest of the players kind of locked down? So Stu, let's start with you.
Well, I think our most important players are locked down. There's some very intriguing names in there, and a lot of ones I'd want to stick around. But we aren't losing Berkey. We're not losing Leuven. We're not losing Klaus. So these are guys who should be kind of rounding out and filling out the roster.
Love it. And I think that's spot on. If I had to pick one person who's, I mean, you could pick probably a few. Jared Stroud was the only one I can think of that spoke overtly looking forward to next year. But there are some key difference makers. Santi, how do you see this group?
Well, I think it's great that the spine is locked down for multiple years. And yeah, then you have this group, some players that were promoted from CD2, and you have options on, some players that came through trades or free agency. But the thing is, and this quote really stuck to me when Jake Nerwinski spoke during his media availability and said, "Yeah, this group from GR1, this is the group that made history." And unfortunately, this is, and I may be misquoting the word, but he basically said this is a business, and some of us, some of this group will not be, some of these guys will not be here next year just because the nature of the business. And yeah, when I see this list, obviously I don't have a crystal ball to say who is gonna leave and who's gonna stay, but yeah, I can see um, at least two or three of these players leaving, and part of it is because the team is going to an international competition. You have to release some of those roster slots to bring some new guys who basically will be guys that will contribute to the depth that you will need to participate in multiple competitions.
So with all these guys up for grabs or in question as far as what's going to happen with them, city or otherwise, the next few weeks become really interesting. So let's look at what the next few weeks look like. And as we go through this quickly, you're going to hear some interesting keywords. Some you may not be familiar with if you're not familiar with the MLS isms, the MLS mechanisms. If you didn't listen to our MLS 2.0 last year, where we talked about some of these in preparation for our expansion draft. This is going to be kind of like that, where we try to get everybody caught up to speed on what these specific dates are and what a lot of the definitions of these terms are. So quickly going through the calendar, and then we'll circle back and get into what all these mean. November 22nd is the first big deadline. That is the club deadline to submit bona fide offers to players. That's November 22nd. We have Thanksgiving that will come. December 1st is going to be the club deadline to exercise options that players might have for next year. December 6th through the 9th, we'll have the MLS College Showcase. December 11th, the trade window opens. December 12th will be end of year waivers and a process that is essentially a draft. December 13th, free agency opens. December 14th is the re-entry process stage 1. So a lot is going to happen in that week of December 11th. That's a Monday. December 19th is a Tuesday. That'll be the super draft. December 21st is reentry process stage 2. And yes, there are 2 halves to that reentry, essentially a draft. And that's kind of it. There is no expansion draft this year because San Diego does not enter until 2025. So if we go back to the beginning on all of this, there's probably some interesting things people haven't heard of. Reentry is going to be an interesting one, free agency as far as MLS goes, but it all starts November 22nd with the club deadline to submit bona fide offers. And a bona fide offer is essentially an offer in writing of a new contract. Usually it increases the value a little bit, but these are out of contract players that the club will extend some kind of a new contract offer to. And as far as we know, or the information that we have, unless you guys have no otherwise, club options are just as much publicized as legit contract ending without an option. Not much of it goes around, not much of it is known, which is common in a lot of these MLS circles, a lot of the MLS financials, a lot of the contract details. It's not known until a change occurs or an announcement as far as an option is picked up. But November 22nd is when the clubs have the deadline to submit those bona fide offers for a new contract in writing. Guys, do you expect any player, or are there any thought, Stu or Santi, to one of these players receiving a bona fide? Do we think or have any reason to believe that any of our players are truly out of contract for this? Santi, what do you think?
Oh, Santi, I think you're muted right now.
Yes, sorry, I was trying to check on our sound on our places since looks like there may have been some issues. But from this list, the one that comes to mind, just because we don't know a lot about his contract situation, is Josh Jarrow,
Hmm.
because we don't know if he has another year or there were options on him. So I would think maybe there. But for the other guys, all of them or most of them had options. Um, and the ones who don't, obviously, and I know we're gonna talk about what an actual free agent is, but I don't see, and this is just from my personal point of view, I don't see John Nelson coming back. He will be the one that will be a free agent, as we call it in our chats, and have fun with that. I don't see him getting an offer. So yeah, to me it will be Jaro, unless I'm missing somebody else that you guys think would be out of contract and could get a bona fide offer.
Yeah, that's the one question I had, just because there's not a whole lot of things known with his contract. Like Stu, we had talked before that Yarrow was on that 1-1 where he was signed to the next pro contract, and then he had the guaranteed year. So he was kind of the first City player signed, even if they didn't publicize it. I think a lot of the players will fall into those option years. And so then that leads us straight to December 1st. So November 22nd being the bona fide offer deadline. December 1st is the real big one that we're looking forward to, because it's the club deadline to extend those options to players, exercise options. And a club option, that's kind of a little more straightforward as far as sports contracts go. It's an add-on to a contract where the club can choose to extend a player's current contract for an additional year. Their salary typically remains the same as it was on their current contract, unless something is negotiated otherwise. So, Stu, if we assume that a lot of these players have options to their contracts, does any one of those players that we listed earlier stand out as, yeah, you think he's likely to be have an option picked up or re-signed, or vice versa?
Well, I think a lot of the guys on the list are actually, I think, likely to come back. And there's some interesting names there, too. And I can go through the list if you want, or just pick out one or two.
Let's give us a few of your top ones.
Okay, I would certainly say that Celio will get his option picked up. I would say Marcanic is certainly going to get an option picked up. Guys like Sam Adeniran and AZ, and both of those guys had GAM, spent on them last year. So I think the club expected to hold on to them long term, and both of them had European interests. So they may not be with City next year, but that doesn't mean that we won't extend their contract.
Yeah, that's a good shout. That players who had GAM invested in them, Sam, AZ, are probably less likely. And those two players include sell-on clauses to their contracts. So there's more of an onus to, or at least there was during their contract or initial trade, to look long-term as far as where they go. And the question would be for both of those players is, do we think there is enough value now to sell them on? You assume you would look to keep them under any circumstance, like you're saying, Stu. And I agree with just about every single one you said. And the question I pose as we look to things beyond the club options are, and guys, circle back to this, but think about how much we need to improve our depth versus the number of players that we kind of want to bring back. Like Stu, you mentioned Celio, Marcanic, Sam, AZ. We talked about Josh. So if you start bringing those players back, then you're looking at 4 or 5 only players that we have left to turn around on a roster. And would that be enough with the depth that we need to kind of ramp up with these additional competitions and all these matches? But those are not the only things. Obviously, you've got the bona fide offers, the club options. The next part of December, between the 6th to the 10th or so, there's probably not a lot that's going to be happening with City. It's the MLS College Showcase, and we saw from last year, guys, City isn't prioritizing collegiate athletes as much as some of the other teams with less robust academies will. Other than Owen O'Malley with his first round pick, it was Johnny Klein was the only other player selected, and that was the local flair. We know that had a reason why he was selected. So I look to December 11th next with the trade window that will be open, and it will be basically a free reign. So I'm excited to see what possibilities City might have with that, but it's entirely up in the air. There's no possible way you could begin to forecast what kind of trades we might have with other players. If the expansion and super drafts taught me anything last year, it's a losing man's battle to attempt to guess what kind of moves could happen in that huge bubble that exists. So you look to end of year waivers, you look to free agency, and waivers themselves are fairly straightforward. It's players who are out of contract, but you still hold the rights to them in MLS. That one, I don't think City will have any real issues with players rounding off. But free agency, this is where I want to touch on, and I want to make sure that you guys keep me honest in how well we understand free agency in MLS. Free agency in MLS, to me, is pretty similar to other leagues. Players are truly eligible to be signed by any other club with no selection order, no processes to follow. It really is one of the more straightforward things that you can actually see in all of this stuff. but there are limitations for the player. And these limitations have been negotiated with the collective bargaining agreement between Major League Soccer and the MLSPA. Players are eligible for free agency when they're out of contract with their current club and had an option declined, also who are at least 24 years old and have completed a minimum of 5 service years in MLS. Out of contract players who received a bona fide offer can still participate in free agency. Players can still re-sign with their current club during free agency. So it's not saying you're gone, you can still re-sign. And there is no limit on the number of free agencies that a single team can sign as long as they stay within their roster limit of 30 players. Santi, you gave a little bit of a spoiler on who we think the likely free agent is. So do you want to reiterate that one?
So before going into that, does it have to be age and service or one of the two?
Age and service is the way it's worded.
Okay.
Which
Okay.
which he meets.
Yeah. Sorry, I misread here what you had. So yeah, our only free agent or the only player that would meet these requirements of being at least 24 years old and have completed a minimum of 5 years of service will be John Nelson, who was with Dallas 3 years, 1 year with FC Cincinnati, and last year with City. So if City chooses to not renew his contract, he will be our only free agent.
And we have a lot of players who are close. Jared Stroud, Michael Creek, Lucas Bartlett, John Bell, Sam Adeniran, and Josh Yarrow would all qualify based on their age, but none have 5 years of MLS service. Jared Stroud and Josh Yarrow both have 4 listed with them. John Bell has 3, Sam Adeniran 3, Bartlett 2, and Creek 1. So none of those players would qualify for free agency. But what they would qualify for, and Stu, I know this is your absolute favorite topic, is re-entry. Re-entry last year, I remember specifically hearing about re-entry and nobody knowing what it was. The word itself, the concept, is an entirely foreign concept to any other sport. And we're not talking about soccer, America. We're talking at all. American sports, soccer globally. Re-entry is the process that is, to me, a direct byproduct of the single entity system and players' contracts being held by MLS. It allows players who do not yet qualify for free agency to be selected by another team. Doesn't give the player the option to choose yet. And players who are eligible for re-entry are at least 22 years old and have a minimum of 1 year of MLS service, who are out of contract and did not receive a bona fide offer, or whose options were not exercised by the club. Like I mentioned earlier, there's 2 stages to this re-entry, and it really is kind of like a draft. Clubs go in reverse order of their 2023 finish, taking into account playoff performances. So it will go starting December 14th with stage 1 at noon. We're going to get a flood that Thursday of reports of teams selecting certain players. And those players are, like I said, at least 22 and have met a minimum of 1 year of MLS service, and the clubs have not extended a bona fide or picked up an option. Stu, what do you make of this? And what's your opinion of this re-entry process in the overall landscape of things?
Well, I think it's actually a tool for the players to kind of free themselves in a way from their parent clubs don't possess their rights to the extent that they would in the past with MLS. And it's kind of an odd one, but they're not obligated to sign with the team that selects them with re-entry, correct? They're just able to negotiate with them. And they're able to opt out. It is bizarre. I believe J.J. Williams was involved with this with Atlanta last year.
Yeah, it does give the players some power. That's a good point. And I think it's kind of like the bridge to free agency. If I try to make this make sense in the context of the overall sports world, I have to liken it to restricted free agency, where it's not necessarily the club specific that has the restriction and has the upper hand, so to speak, or can have a final say, but it's the league. And if the player stays within the league, then it allows them to move, but their contract is still held invalid and can be picked up by another team. So that's the only thing I can kind of liken it to. But yeah, Chris Gebhardt in chat says, reminds me a little of the Rule 5 draft in baseball. It's a totally different process, but it frees players up a little bit to be selected by other clubs. That's a good. I like that comparison. I think I'm going to use that one. The Rule 5 draft in baseball.
Is
Yeah,
there any compensation involved in this, like between clubs or no?
don't
No,
believe
no.
so.
Yeah, because there's not, because the player has not received a bona fide offer and the contract option
Right.
was not extended. So the club has kind of washed their hands and said, we're willing to let you be available to all the other clubs with no compensation. And really quickly, before we get too far into this one, the only City player we believe is not eligible for even the re-entry process would be Max Schneider, who was on loan for the entirety of his 1 year with MLS. That's an educated guess. Like most of this, I mean, most of this are educated guesses because they publicize nothing of this MLS City, and it's the byproduct of the single entity system and their lack of transparency. So
uh, so since he was on loan, does that count as a year of service at all, or he's at 0 years of service?
my opinion, he's at 0 years, but the fact that he was under contract, would that make
Right.
it a year?
Well, you say Josh Yarrow's on 4 years, but Josh Yarrow got drafted in 2018.
If I remember correctly, he was with Philadelphia for 3 years. So
Okay.
that will be three, and this year will be four.
Yeah, that's what I had.
Yeah. So I would say no because he was on loan in USL.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Maybe that's
So with Max Schneider is actually a good bridge to the next definition, which is waivers, and waivers actually occurs on December 12th. So backing up a couple days, waivers is the selection process conducted in reverse order of the 23 season finish and considering postseason performances. A player qualifies for waivers if they do not meet the minimum requirements for the reentry process or free agency. So this is that last little bucket that if Max Schneider doesn't qualify for reentry, he would qualify for waivers, and that would basically be the only player City has that would qualify for that. Guys, we've kind of reached the drafting portion of this because the different processes. The reentry has a stage 2 that'll be on December 21st, kind of putting a cap on all these activities before the holidays, and it's the same exact process. It's the players who are qualified for stage 1, they weren't selected, they're all available for selection, and they can be picked up. But to Stu's point, one thing I do want to reiterate for the reentry draft is that players can be selected, but an agreement might not be made. The player might not want to play for that club, they might not agree to contract terms. So what happens is the drafting club will hold the right of first refusal for that player. They basically have their rights. So if you select a player in reentry, if City selects a player in reentry and they don't come to terms, that player is still protected by City. And if another team wants that player, they'll have to give City compensation for them. So watching what happens in the reentry process will be very interesting.
And the compensation. Go ahead, Stu.
Something that's interesting is I don't believe that extends to MLS Next Pro contracts. So they would hold the MLS rights for a player picked up off of waivers or reentry, but someone could sign for MLS Next Pro, and as long as they don't play for MLS on an MLS team or roster, they would still. So this happened a few years ago with draft picks.
Yep.
Super draft pick where I think it was Atlanta United drafted a keeper whose rights were owned by Austin, I believe, and they just stuck him in MLS or USL for a year, and then they negotiated it. But that's how I read this, and that's how
it is.
Yeah,
you're spot on. It and that could happen. So a player whose rights are held by another MLS club, if they're selected, can be stashed basically. And so as long as they don't play for MLS and they don't have contract situations like that, they can be signed outside of all of these other mechanisms. So we haven't even gotten into Next Pro. The biggest consideration for Next Pro, and I think it can be boiled down to this, is that talking about all of these re-entries, free agencies, waivers, if their rights are held by a club but they're not on the roster, teams can kind of begin to get around that by signing them directly to their affiliate. There are no restrictions to Next Pro contracts that say you have to respect anything from MLS. So players can be signed directly to an affiliate, Next Pro or a USL championship team can sign them as well without any impact to MLS. A player can exist and be playing on a next pro roster, like Stu said, and their MLS rights can be held by a completely other club. That does happen, and it might happen this year. It would be interesting to see if City gets involved in that aspect of it.
Yeah, and Atlanta did that again with the U22 player, and we haven't gotten into U22 yet, but they did that 2 years ago, I believe. They signed a player in the summer window and basically stashed him with Atlanta too until January, where they could promote him basically to a U22 contract.
Last thing we have to look forward to is the Super Draft. And for St. Louis, I don't know how much we really have to look forward to that. Using an educated guess from last year and looking at the results from last year, let's be honest, guys, and let's be brutally honest a little bit. Our first round Super Draft pick did not work out. And that's a question that Lutz is probably working with his technical staff on how much they're valuing the Super Draft based on that experience. We don't know what happened to Owen O'Malley. We just know that Owen O'Malley has been absent from even City 2 rosters for the back half of the year. And he hasn't been training with the first team. It seems like he's on the outs. Best we can tell, right, Santi? I mean, how do we view Owen O'Malley in the context, especially in the context of the Super Draft going forward?
Yeah, that's one player I would say is on his way out. As you mentioned, at the end of the year, he wasn't with City or with City 2, and we know he was suspended for conduct detrimental to the team or the team policies.
Yep.
So I would think he's on his way out. But when you talk about the draft, one thing that came to mind, yeah, obviously City selected Owen O'Malley, but I the first thing I think about when the super draft from last year comes up is Duncan Maguire from Orlando City. It's like
Yeah.
you always think like, oh, I wonder what would have been if City had drafted him, but obviously hard to know, and maybe he's not a player that will have been good for the system, but he has had a lot of success with Orlando. But yeah, definitely just from the City perspective, based on this experience from last year's draft, from the 2023 draft, um, probably they won't give it as much weight as other clubs would. But you never know. Maybe they will find a player that fits the system, and maybe they will do a trade and get in the first round. Those things during the draft are definitely unexpected. So you could see that happening too.
Stu, what do you think we do in the Super Draft where we know that St. Louis has already traded away their first round pick to Colorado in the Anthony Marcanic trade? We still hold the second and third round picks currently, and last year kind of showed that we were willing to go more towards the local flair than otherwise. Do you see this Super Draft that comes up on December 19th as being kind of fruitful for St. Louis?
I don't see that, to be honest. And we saw also during the draft last year, we traded the first round pick twice. So we traded it once. We had the first overall, and then we traded to the 8th spot, and then to the 9th, or the 6th to the 9th, one of those two. But Lutz said afterward that even if we drafted first, we were going to draft O'Malley. Which is one of those things you're always going to say about your guy. I don't think Duncan was ever on our radar. I mean, CJ Fodry was the kind of the consensus first overall, and he slipped. And really, outside of Duncan Maguire, no one's really shown from the first round of last year's draft. But yeah, I would concur with Santi that I don't expect Owen O'Malley to be back. Especially considering he played at such a position of weakness for the City senior squad, and he just failed to make an impact and even train for a while. So I expect maybe, who knows, maybe we'll draft a SIUE guy. Like I really like City Kassan. The club's familiar with him.
Yeah,
he's done well. I wouldn't be unhappy. I mean, I would be very happy if we drafted him in, the third round or something, gave him a chance to sign with City or City 2. But otherwise, who knows who the club is scouting? But Sadiq Hassan would be my local flair guy who I would see as like a really positive pick, similar to Johnny Klein.
And if you look to, like we said at the beginning, if this is now the year 3 of 5, then Lutz has potentially a couple years left of this super draft. And this is the year where you look for trends. Last year, Johnny Klein was brought on. You look to see if they're going to continue to use the super draft in that manner, or if they're going to think a little more like a normal or it's a traditional MLS team and go that route. So it'll be interesting to see. And guys, let's look to, as we finish this up, some of the players that we talked about earlier who are out of contract. Let's discuss a little bit who we think. Stu mentioned his earlier, but I've got my own thoughts. Santi, I know you do. You're listening to us on the Big 550 KTRS for our offseason preview here on Flyover Footy. Thank you for joining us. And don't forget to tune into our podcast. If you're not listening to us on the podcast, we are going to, in our wind down, Santi and I are going to look to some salary budgets, allocation monies. We're going to do some projecting and predicting on what we have available based on the fact that we don't know all of the data, but it's always fun to speculate. So that'll be on our wind down. Tune into the podcast if you're listening to us on the Big 550 KTRS. Now, Santi, Stu gave us his top few players that he wants to see re-signed or thinks will be re-signed. What do you think? We already talked about Owen O'Malley. We talked about John Nelson. We're looking at guys like Lucas Bartlett, John Bell, Michael Creek, Max Schneider, Jared Stroud that we haven't talked about yet. Those guys, Stu's guys, what do you think?
So I'm gonna start with the center back position where you have John Bell and Lucas Bartlett. Also, Josh Jarrow is part of that group, but we already talk about him. But yeah, I would think one of John Bell or Lucas Bartlett will not be brought back, and not because they are not good players, but just because you need to release roster slots to be able to bring other players. So one of those two I see not resigning. And then Stu was mentioning before we went live. He talked about Michael Crick and maybe making that third goalkeeper position maybe a younger player, an academy product, which I think it will make sense when you are thinking about developing your goalkeeper of the future. Like have a guy that is young, learn from Berkey and learn from Ben Lund too, who based on what we have heard has great leadership skills, and he can also step in for Berkey if he gets injured or something. So I can see also Michael Crick not resigning and maybe giving an opportunity to one of the academy keepers, thinking about what's going to happen. And Matt, keep me honest. Berkey is through 2025, right? His contract.
Yes.
Yeah. So is Berkey going to resign when his contract is up, or is this something the club needs to start thinking about and maybe start developing that goalkeeper of the future? But yeah, I think I will use that third goalkeeper position to develop a young player.
So I'm going to use my abilities as host to sidestep the question entirely and not anger anybody for my thoughts that I have on players. I share a lot of it with you guys, though. I'm just joking in the sense that we kind of get a sense of who has separated themselves from the pack. In my mind, I look at guys like, I'm going to say names because, of course, Jared Stroud, Celio Pompeu, Anthony Marcanic, Sam Adeniran, Akil Watts, Lucas Bartlett, AZ Jackson, all of those guys are top of the tier. They're separating themselves in what they've shown this year and the growth that they've had. I agree with you, Santi. One center back probably, but the thing that I walk away from is, and Chris Gebhardt mentioned it in the chat, City 2 has the progression path that you have to keep alive. And so if you have all of these players locked up that we haven't mentioned because they're locked into multi-year contracts, and you have some City 2 guys that you want to keep that pipeline going, you want to keep building that, then how many of these players can you truly bring back if you're going to enhance your depth? Because if you bring back a lot of these players, you're really saying that you're ready for them to take the next step, the next evolution to be meaningful contributors much more than they were, and consistent contributors. So the idea that we have all these guys we've grown to know and love, it's going to be hard to say goodbye to a lot of them if need be. But there's a lot of eggs, a lot of eggs in the pan on this one. There's a lot of irons in the fire as far as elevating City 2 players, competing for the Continental CONCACAF Champions Cup, all these competitions we have with the depth. So I'll leave us with the fact that no matter what happens for options that get picked up and who doesn't, it's going to be a long month. It's a long building process to look to find the best players who will fit our system and to fill a lot of the gaps that we've seen exposed as the year went on. The end of the season was a lesson learned in where our depth falters at times and where our biggest needs are. So, guys, any last comments before we go, Stu?
I'm gonna say on the City 2, I think Michael Wenzel gets a contract for City 1 next year and replaces one of those center back slots. I mean, I could go through real quick on mine if you want to.
Do it.
I'll anger some people.
Do it.
I mean, why not? Where's the fun? Schneider, I think, frees up the international roster spot. I don't think he comes back. I don't think Owen O'Malley comes back. I think, disagree with Matt, and I would not bring back Jared Stroud. I'm
glad somebody disagrees with me.
I agree with Stu on that one.
I think there's a big area for improvement there. Not that Jared's bad, but that's a spot you could improve upon if you want to go and sign someone with more potential, maybe, or a greater ceiling. Celio, I'd bring back. Markanik, I would bring back, but also hopefully bring in another left back option. John Nelson, I would not bring back. Josh Yarrow, I would bring back. Sam Adeniran, yes, but I do think he might get sold. Akil Watts, I'm kind of on the fence on. I like Akil a lot, but I think defensively he's struggled as a right back, and right back is a position we have to reinforce. John Bell and Lucas Bartlett, one of the two will be back. I think they'll be our fourth or fifth choice center back. So ideally, neither of them see too much action. AZ, I would bring back, but I think he's out the door. And Michael Creek, I think you give that spot to a younger guy. If it's Bishop or Owen Spoor.
Even Oliveras from City 2.
Yeah.
Oliveras was impressive. I think Eric Walker at one point was looked as a long-term guy. I know that Achilles injury really is hard to recover from, but he has a massive ceiling. But ultimately, Tim Kelly as goalkeeper coach really knows his stuff over there. So if he really likes Michael Creek, then I will trust him.
Good stuff, Stu. I love getting spicy there at the end. That's it for us. We're Flyover Footy. Thank you for listening to us on the Big 550 KTRS. We're going to get out of here. Happy holidays. Thanks for joining us. If you're listening to us on the podcast, stick around for the wind down. And happy holidays, everybody. We'll talk to you later. All right. So if you're with us on the stream, we'll be right back. Stu, are you out?
Yeah, I'm out. I'm going to do a little bit of work and homework and then go to sleep.
All right, man.
All right. See you, Stu.
All right.
Cheers, buddy.
See you guys.
All right, Santi. Back with drinks.
Yep.
Stu drops in our group chat. Stu drops in our group chat that he loves stirring the pot, and so I responded with, "I'm cutting all that out for the radio." I'm not, but
Hey, just obviously we didn't have time, but if I'm gonna say this, if Michael Wenzel is signed, I think both Bartlett and John Bell will be out. Just because if you just
Yep.
sign one of them and then you bring another center back, now you are in that same having 4 or 5 center backs, and you need more
Yeah.
depth in our positions.
I totally agree with that. Totally agree with that. All right, you ready to get going?
Let's do it.
All right. Welcome back, everybody, to the wind down. It feels kind of weird when I do it myself. I kind of miss Phil's luscious voice leading us in, but we'll get over it. So
Miss
Santi,
you, Phil.
I miss you, Phil. He's enjoying some time off, much needed time off, and we'll get that too. So we are we'll recap at the end what our schedule looks like, but we will be taking some time off for the holidays here. This second part, so the wind down is usually that chill time where we kind of get into more conversational stuff, but because I'm running the show today, we're going to get a little nerdy on some things.
All right.
I'm going to try not to blow everybody's mind. I'm going to try to I wordsmith this. I legitimately wrote myself a little bit of a script because I felt like I would just start rambling on all of this stuff. So bear with me when I talk through this. And as a palate cleanser before we get going, in the chat, Chris Gebhardt asked if we're going to the season ticket holder holiday event on Saturday. So if you're listening to us before Saturday, yes, we'll be there. If you listen to Flyover, please, for the love of God, come up and say hi. I absolutely love seeing people. If you haven't gotten a sticker, Flyover, I'll have them there. And there's going to be photo opportunities. It's going to be a fun time. Are you going to be there, Santi?
I'm gonna be there, and
There you go.
Matt, that has been one of my favorite things of this year. Like people coming and saying, "Hey, Santi, I listen to you guys. You do a great job." And I always try to carry the stickers too and give a sticker out. So it's great interacting with our listeners.
Yes, nothing I love more. So, there's a question in the chat also about, do we think Hebert moves back to center back depth, find another left back? We will get into that, I promise. There's a lot to deal with as far as an MLS offseason. And a lot of it has to do with what we don't know. So I alluded to it earlier on, the fact that allocation money is just not made public. Like, yes, the league does tell you how much money you get at the beginning of the year. If you make transactions with allocation money, you publicize that as far as trades go. But the nuances in the roster rules are so heavy-handed as far as the uses for allocation money, the bonuses. I swear, the word bonus does so much work in the roster rules. You get bonuses for missing the playoffs. You get bonuses for making CONCACAF Champions Cup, but none of it is publicized. It could be 500,000. It could be 5,000. We don't know. So
5,000.
City made the playoffs, so we know we don't get that bonus. They reward the teams, or at least they help out the teams. Let's say that. Not reward. They help out the teams who don't make the playoffs by giving them a little more allocation money. So continuing the parity. But we'll work with what we know. And so as I go through the numbers besides the buckets, keep in mind that this is all educated guesses based on tracking everything we've done so far this year, which I've done my best to. Looking at all of the available mechanisms we have, TAM, GAM, DPs, U22s, all of that stuff. So the thing to look at as we go from 23 to 24 is there's going to be raises in everything across the board. This year in 2023, there was a salary budget of $5.21 million. Every team had to stick under a $5.21 million salary. Next year, it goes up to 5.47. We're talking incremental increases. There's a bigger increase in general allocation money given to each team. 2023, each team got 1.9 million in general allocation money. 2024, each team gets 2.585, a little over $600,000 increase. Discretionary TAM goes down a little bit. They're phasing out TAM over the next few years, and they're increasing GAM because it has a much wider use. You can use GAM in just about everything, but TAM has specific uses like buying down would-be designated players. It's not tradable. That's the end. That's basically it. TAM goes down from 2.72 to 2.4 million. All of that boils to what they call an available roster spend. So totaling all three of these numbers, this year the available roster spend for teams was 9.83 million. Next year, it goes up to 10.455. And essentially, the only thing this doesn't take into consideration are designated players. So designated players will increase salary, but they only hit the salary budget at that max individual salary, which this year was like 651,000. So they add on. So you saw those numbers from the Athletic that look to every team's roster is this much in salary spend. That's adding DPs. That's how they're able to get above that. If you just use the salary and the allocation monies, you get to these numbers, 10.455 million next year. The idea of what City is able to do with that is going to be one of the most interesting things. And part of that is carrying forward for the first time all of the work that we've done this year. And so that's where tracking this year has come into really somewhat of an important thing. It's kind of this is what I've been working towards all year, is hoping to have enough information to make educated guesses about what we're going into. So Santi, what I've pulled in, and this is where, I'll turn it over to you and what you think about this after, but this is where I need you to strap in and try to stay with me. I'm going to try not to bore everybody,
I'll
but
do
this
my
is
best.
just like 2 minutes, bear with me, of my ultimate nerdy and what I've put together. If we assume that City came in near the max of their salary cap in 2023, which is the most economical since the salary won't roll over, but all of GAM and TAM do roll over for us in 2024, then I'm showing that we'll have just over $700,000 of GAM and TAM to roll over. This gives us a general idea of what we'll be able to work with in the next year. Factors to consider are going to be which players do not re-sign, whose salary is going to come off the books, different transfer fees of some players that get averaged out over the life of their contracts, like Selmer Pedro, Ben Lunt, Jabulu Blom, Nukvi Thoresen, who have higher transfer fees or salaries that will get averaged out. And most importantly, you take into consideration those new buckets of GAM and TAM that I just mentioned. So looking at all of the things we had in 2023, our overall salary spend this year was a bit over 11 million. Our overall transfer fees were about 6.583 million of what we know that was publicized or reported. And that does not include Klaus and Leuven. The only transfer fees that will be a consideration next year are those that are averaged out, those transfer fees that are averaged out over the life of a contract. We're looking at Selmer Pedro, Ben Lunt, Jabulu Blom, Nukvi Thoresen. Those total $624,700 per year that we're going to need to account for because MLS averages out the transfer fees over the life of a player's contract. Between rolling over $700,000 of GAM and TAM, getting 4.985 million more in those buckets, and looking to a few of those 2024 GAM transactions that we've already made, like outgoing GAM for Tim Parker and for Sam Adeniran, incoming GAM from the Charlotte Super Draft trade last year, and trading Atlanta United for an international slot, I think we're going to go into 2024 with a total of around $5.635 million of allocation money, plus a salary budget of around $5.47 million. And our 2023 salary and allocation money needs were 9.35 in this past year. So, depending on who we re-sign that we talked about before, I'm estimating that City's going to have a total of $3.056 million worth of space between salary and allocation money, which is a pretty huge amount after already covering all of the existing roster cap and roster space, given the players that we expect to be re-signed. And remembering that the salary cap is only applicable to the senior roster, the first 20 players on the team. A lot of the guys who we've talked about who have their options up or their contracts expiring are on our supplemental roster. So the fact that our salary spend only applies to the senior roster is a huge consideration. The 10 players on the supplemental roster make some of the roster minimums. They don't count towards that salary cap. I'll end with the fact that players last year like Sam Az and Jared Stroud, who ended up being difference makers, were acquired from other clubs, and we weren't very active in the free agent market or reentry process last year. But that has definitely now become a viable and cost-effective way to sign players who might be making relatively lower salaries and mitigating some of those internal or external to MLS transfers. So being smart with what you need to do with your books. Santi, have I bored you to death yet?
No, but my head is about to explode. But I like that 3 million number that you're estimating we will have available.
And the
Obviously,
big thing with the 3 million is that's on top of all of the players who are already on the books. So
I love it.
trying to forecast who we have on the books, what they're going to take up, money we've carried over, new money we're getting in those buckets. That's sizable.
Yeah, even if some of the assumptions are wrong, let's say it is 2.5, it's still a very good number considering that you already have your spine secure and you are just looking to improve some positions, get some depth,
Mhm.
thinking about CONCACAF Champions Cup. So I think the team is in a great position to get some of the players it has on its list of, okay, I need these two positions and these are the two or three that I'm gonna target. It's good. It's a good starting point. I like it. And you haven't mentioned this yet, but I'm sure that at some point we're gonna talk about international spots, right?
Yeah, and that is a consideration because while we do have all this GAM, TAM, allocation money, salary availability, international slots will take up a bit of that. Unless we've been extremely lucky with our green card situation in getting some of our international players green cards, we went into 2023 having 11 international players on our roster. One of those was Max Schneider, and he was on loan, so that admittedly didn't take up an international slot. But of players currently on our roster right now, recalling Max Schneider, we have 11. Each year, the number of allowed international slots essentially resets to 8. You can trade for multi-year international slots, but it doesn't really happen. So we'll just say that every year, each team resets their amount to 8. That's why in the offseason, especially in the winter and in the January transfer window, you'll see a lot of transactions for acquiring international slots. You'll see the jokes that, oh man, I can't wait to slot in our international slot in our defensive mid, and it's
Yeah.
hilarious every time. But we're gonna need to get either some more international slots, which means outgoing GAM, or we're gonna need to hear about players not taking up international slots and having green cards, which we will be trying to find out if that's the case. We will be asking that question. So if it doesn't get publicized, we're going to try to find out because that's massively impactful to how an MLS roster is constructed, and it will save us $100, $200, $300 in allocation money, depending on what the market is at the time for those slots.
And I would think that we even thought at the beginning of the season that maybe some of the guys that came in July of 2022 were close to getting their green card. So I would think that group, we should hear something on some of them or on all of them. But it's been a year and a half. Unless there is a delay or something that is not allowing things to go through, I would think all these players that came between July and August of 2022 will get their green cards, which will release some international slots for us.
If we can get everybody that came over around that July, August time period in 22, if we can get them in a green card going into next season, that would be massive. We're talking about Max Schneider if he's still on the team, obviously. Talking about Roman Berkey, Klaus, Leuven, Ostrak, Pedro if he rejoins the club. Like all of these guys, Pedro might be an outside thought since he's on loan, but all these other guys who were part of City 2 last year, massive benefit if we can get most of those green. That would save us legitimately hundreds of thousands, if not $1 million in GAM if we're able to do that. Because teams, if we don't use up all of our international slots, then suddenly we have the potential to trade away and acquire some more. I mean, it's a boon to business if you can be smart with your international slots and your green card situation. It's another way that the growing City front office can position themselves better for the future with a lot of these guys on multi-year contracts, even extending out until 25, like you mentioned with Berkey, or 26, 27 with a Leuven and an Ostrak, those kinds of things, and a Jensen when he comes back. Like these are long-term things that are considerations for City. Santi, I mentioned that all of this potential large amount of allocation money that we'll have available, or large amount of salary spend between however they decide to bucket it out between the salary and allocation money buckets. If you look to some of the players that we've spent that money on here recently and what we can expect from how much is Lutz willing to pay for a transfer fee for certain types of players, I think it can give us a good idea as we look to some of the depth positions that we're really going to need to be targeting, where we think that City should kind of pivot their attention. Looking at guys like Nuke V. Thorson, who had an estimated $600,000+ transfer fee. His transfer fee hits at around $267,000 per year because of his contract length. So we're talking a lot of money for Thorson. We're talking Blom at around 315,000. We're looking at Selmer Pedro, who had a $300,000 transfer fee. These are pretty sizable numbers for guys who have not proven a ton yet, but we see the caliber. So Jabulu Blom is probably the most proven of the players at $315,000 transfer fee. Nuki Thorson, Lutz has said that his eye is always on next year. So if I look to project not just the quality, but the depth for his position, I have to slot Thorson in as a potential starter for next year just based on where he's forecasted. And comparing Thorson's end of 23 to, let's say, a Klaus or Leuven's end of 22 in how much time they played with the team they came here for. It wasn't a ton, but it was enough to get acclimated. So do you want to look to some of these positions that we think might be key needs as we go into this offseason and what you might have? Because let's start it off with the question from Fatbug24 in the chat. Do you think Hebert moves back to the depth at center back and they find another left back?
That's definitely a position. I think the team is going to try to find somebody to bring, and you kind of still have Hebert as he's part of your depth chart as center back, but if something happens to that new option and then to Anthony Marcani, Hebert can fill in, especially when the schedule gets congested. So yeah, I think he will be part of that center back depth, and if the team brings a left back, it will probably be somebody who will be above Hever and Marcanic, or somebody who will compete with them to get that starting role. So yeah, I like that flexibility that Hever could provide as both center back and left back. But Matt, I don't want to forget, with all this money that it's available, I think another scenario, another option that the club, and this is more me wanting it, is that, hey, there is money, so look at filling up those U22 slots. There is money there to spend, and then you also have the flexibility on the budget side.
I was waiting for you to bring it up. I didn't want to tee it up too well for you, but this is your bread and butter, I feel, because it plays into a lot of the desire for City to sign South American talent too, and that's been a loud outcry from a portion of the fan base to have just more representation in general. But we see how much the U22 initiative comes from South America, whether it's Argentina, whether it's Colombia, whether it's Chile, like all of these, this area is scouted so well for that type of player. And the reason that we harp on U22 isn't just the concept of signing and developing and then selling on, but as a refresher, MLS roster rules directly reward you for signing players under the age of 22 to your senior roster. You're afforded massive salary relief in the same vein as a designated player. U22s that are signed and slotted into U22 initiative slots, every team gets 3 of them. They only hit the salary budget at about $150,000. And so you're looking at being able to pay a player hundreds of thousands, approaching $1 million potentially, but they only hit the salary budget at $150,000. That's huge. And if we talk about how to make the most out of this $2 to $3 million, whatever it is that we'll have available to us in this offseason to build our roster, to flesh it out, then that would shore up such a core piece of it, no matter what position they play. But if you're able to sign that level of a talent and say, we expect this much from this player and they're only costing us $150,000 to our salary budget, massive, absolutely huge. And we haven't seen that utilized at all, because a lot of the conversation in 23 is centered around our designated players, Klaus, Leuven, Berkey, will he, won't he type of a thing, where we don't have a third DP, but for roster building purposes, we could have slotted him in. We just would have had to pay a small penalty to MLS. But we didn't do that. Berkey was, by all accounts, not a designated player, so we only had 2 DPs. We had no young designated player, which is a U23 with the same concept. They hit the salary budget at about 200,000 and no U22s. So we have all of these other mechanisms available to us as we round out our roster, no matter who we don't re-sign. But looking ahead to the external transfer window, really, because that's where all these come into play. It's players on their first contract to MLS. This is really on top of everything we've discussed so far. Is how can Lutz and Bradley and company make the most of these slots and make them matter long term? Because maybe they just didn't have that. They didn't strike gold their first year, and that's fine. But if you go 2-3 years, if Lutz goes his entire career with City, having not signed a single U22, you got to look back and say that has to be a mistake on some level. Yeah, you can make an argument that you just didn't find the right talent, but at the end of the day, it's your job to find that kind of a talent and to make the most of your roster space that works in your system. That's a key piece of the roster build that you're just not taking advantage of, which does impact other areas. It impacts your ability to sign other high-value potential players if you're not taking advantage of what MLS gives you.
Yeah, definitely try to use all those tools and mechanisms that are at your disposal. And I have a feeling that we will see a U22 player this year. I was trying to look for a quote from the end of the year press conference. I remember Lutz saying, when talking about the next transfer window, he was saying it doesn't have to be the best player, just a player that fits the system. And I think that's where some of these U22s can come in. Maybe they are not the best player yet, but you bring them young, and it gives you advantages on the budget side, and you can develop them, have them play for 2-3 years, and maybe make some money out of it. Later on. And at the same time, as you said, like, if you use those mechanisms, you will still have money left to sign other players that may be more expensive. And this is I know people talk a lot about Miami bringing Messi and signing a lot of players, but basically what allowed them to sign so many players, what to use to make use of all those mechanisms. And I'm sure some teams will be looking at that and say, hey, we should be doing that and using all those mechanisms. So I hope in City somehow uses all or most of them.
Yeah, what Miami was able to do was, it was made fun of in a lot of circles, but aside from what happened to them previously with, I think it was it Chris Henderson was their GM.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from the whole sanctioning and the fines and everything, what they were able to do this last year, not just in bringing in Messi, but overhauling their roster, would not have been possible without some of the moves they made, taking advantage of basically everything MLS allowed them to take advantage of. Even going back to Joseph Martinez, who they signed from Atlanta, Atlanta picked up enough of his salary that he wasn't a designated player for them.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, outsiders can look to MLS and say, oh, that's a joke that they're creating these mechanisms and Joseph Martinez doesn't count, blah, blah, blah. But MLS they have these rules, and they're convoluted rules, and they take a lot to navigate. But you have to give a team like Miami credit for leveraging what they have done to be able to build what they're going towards next year. And in that sense, yeah, they do have to be looked at as the model, because U22s in particular, then they've signed 3 of them, aren't just good until they're 22. You can sign a U22 player who's, say, 20 years old. You can sign him to a 5-year contract up until the age of 25, and he's still benefiting your salary that in that way. So ages 20 and younger, it hits at 150,000. Ages 21 to 25, 200,000. It's a small difference that you have. It's basically cost control. If you liken it to baseball, you have cost control over a player for a certain period of years, certain service, right? It's the similar concept of being able to benefit from that. And we haven't taken advantage of that at all yet. And I would struggle to, but I'd be frustrated to, but I could give him a pass for another year if something happens next summer. But if you go multiple years without taking advantage of any of these mechanisms, then the notion of, and I don't mean to be too critical, because I never intend to be too critical, especially after coming off the season we did. But if you don't take advantage of those types of scenarios, then you're not truly setting yourself up for success long term within the confines of what MLS is affording you to. I'm not asking you to find the absolute best U22 that is in South America and try to sign them I'm asking you to find a U22 that fits your bill and would be a like-for-like player to maybe an Edu Leuven in quality, but you can sign them for so much cheaper and have so much control over their cost relative to your salary charge for 4 or 5 years, and then sell them on. That's the other benefit, is you have all this ability to control your own roster spend, but then you have the sell on. So the whole purpose of U22 initiative is to sign young, develop, sell on, rinse and repeat. Make all of these massive, outgoing transfers, and all of those outgoing transfers, when you add up over all the MLS teams incrementally, it does add up to that story they tell about the league turning into a selling league. Like, they're giving the teams all of these options, all these capabilities. City just needs to join the club and start using them.
Yeah, I really hope we start seeing the club using some of those. If you think about long term, yeah, if you wanna be up there with the Seattles and LAFCs of the MLS, you have to make use of anything you have at your disposal to continue building a competitive roster. And yeah, maybe I will be a little disappointed if nothing happens in during this window with any of those. But hopefully, if it's not this window, hopefully during the summer window. But yeah, at some point it needs to happen.
And we know, especially in Europe, a lot of the contracts end in the summer, and so it will be interesting to see where we find any potential signings that are outside of MLS in this window. That's always an interesting January transfer window conversation. Santi, where do you see our biggest area of need? And I'll start with the Matt Doyle article on MLSsoccer.com that specified fullback, and that's not a hot take to say that fullback is our biggest area of need, but you see left or right back as the bigger area of need.
Ooh.
And let me give you a moment to think, with caveats of, in this scenario, let's say we have Kyle Hebert on the roster, we have Anthony Marcanic on the roster, Selmer Pedro remains on loan, Johnny Nelson is gone, we have re-signed Akil Watts, we still have Nerwinski under contract, and we've let O'Malley go. With that scenario in mind,
I'm gonna. It's difficult, but I'm gonna go left, just because just thinking that Kyle Hebert, you may need him to fill in at center back at some point, and yeah, just have a Kyle Hebert was converted from center back to left back, and he did okay. But just thinking Marcanic is still young. I will bring a left center back that either has experience in MLS or has experience playing overseas. So to me, is that left back position, but I could go either way. But yeah, definitely the biggest need is fullbacks.
I'm not even going to pretend to take the opposing point of view. I definitely think it's left back, and we could go with a higher quality overall right back. Sure, you could always improve at any one position, but left back is it. And I would be a little disappointed if we went into the 2024 season with Kyle Hebert. I would be very disappointed, let's just say that, if we went into it with Kyle Hebert and Anthony Marcanic as our left backs, for two reasons. One, Kyle Hebert is a converted center back. He wasn't intended to play left back, and he's done an admirable job in the time that he's been there. He's won more games than he's lost as our left back, and he's definitely grown and developed throughout the year. And you can't look him in the eye in person and have a bad thing to say about him, because his personality and his drive and commitment is second to none. But his home is at center back, and that's where I think he provides the best option for us and for himself. Anthony Marcanic was very specifically signed to be the backup. Lutz was very open about that, right? The transfer, when I asked him about the transfer window at the season-ending press conference, he said Anthony Marcanic was signed to be the backup. And what he showed at the end of the season was phenomenal. And everybody was kind of, if not taken aback, then pleasantly surprised in how he was able to take that role and run with it for a period of time. But I don't think he's there to be, if we want to compete in all of these competitions in MLS for the season run, he's not our starting left back. He is a rotational left back that we can use to start in the US Open Cup, potentially use to start in the CONCACAF Champions Cup, and be happy about that. I wouldn't be upset if we started Marcanic in any of those competitions, but for running the table back in MLS play, I want to see us make a splash at left back. I want to see a significant signing because now we know the importance that the fullbacks have in this system. We've seen it. It's not a projection. It's not, well, City 2 did this, or we saw Ezra Armstrong, or we saw like Sergio Rivas or whoever it was at right back. We saw what they did in City 2, so I think they're going to do something similar. We have a pretty good sample size now, full season's worth of data of what this system does consistently in how they run that asynchronous approach, whether it's pushing up the right, pushing up the left. They do one of those fairly regularly. And so having Watts and Nerwinski on the right back side, if you continue to develop them, especially Akil Watts, it gives you some flexibility on what you can do with left back, but you still need somebody of a higher caliber to take you to that next level. You need, and I'm not advocating for signing this player, especially in light of recent events, but you need a Kai Wagner type of a player. That's the caliber that I'm looking to, and I wouldn't be disappointed if we didn't, because it's not like I expect us to sign that kind of a player. But that's one of the players where I say, all right, left back is the biggest area of need, and if we're gonna make a splash and we're gonna sign the highest type of a caliber player that I think we're capable of, Kai Wagner, that type of a player is where I want us to go. Beyond that, I mean, right back, I don't know. I don't know if that's going to be an area of focus with Jake Nerwinski and Akil Watts, but I do think there's some interesting things at center back, Santi. And I'm interested to hear what you think about this thought. So we have Tim Parker, we have Joachim Nielsen, right? Let's assume both of them come back healthy, both of them are ready to go. Let's assume we sign a left back. And so Kyle Hebert now becomes more center back depth. We have Kyle Hebert, we have Michael Wenzel, who we talked earlier in the show about likely to be signed, and we have Josh Yarrow. I think it was Stu that mentioned, given that there's no reason to re-sign Lucas Bartlett or John Bell. So, would you be okay with those 5 as our center backs if we did sign a new left back? Or do you think we would need additional help at center back?
No, I think that will be enough. You have a mix of experience and some young players, assuming Michael Wenzel is signed. And then the other thing that I connect to the right back position, and maybe just staying with Akil Watts and Jake Nerwinski, Josh Jarrow had a couple of games where he played right back, so he could be an option there should that become necessary. So yeah, I would be comfortable with that mix of Tim Parker, Joachim Nilsson, Kyle Hebert, Michael Wenzel, and Josh Jarrow as center back. And yeah, like the team had more options at that position this year, but as we had mentioned, like the team needs to. We know it's only 30 roster slots, so you need to release some of those in order to be able to have some slots for some of these new players you want to bring. So yeah, I'll be okay with those 5 being the center back depth.
I want to look at something that I think has gone a little bit overlooked, and probably deservedly so, over the past few weeks, and that's our homegrown players. Going into 2024, we have 3 homegrown players under contract. We have Caden Glover, we have Miggy Perez, and we have Tyson Pierce. Tyson Pierce was signed officially on Thursday, August 16th, 2023, to an MLS homegrown contract through 2027 with an option for 2028. He's a midfielder and was signed as the club's 3rd MLS homegrown. So, Santi, how much of an impact do you see these 3 playing? And does it impact our need for certain positions? Like if we assume that, let's assume that Sam gets re-signed, that puts us at Klaus, Nico, Sam, Caden, potentially Rasmus Alm up at a striker if we run a 4-4-2. Would you see us needing to sign anybody at the striker position if that's the case? And then do you think that Tyson Pierce and Miggy Perez are able to take those steps to be meaningful contributors at all next year?
So I'm gonna start with Tyson Pierce and and Miggy Perez. So obviously Miguel Perez, he contributed at the on the early part of the season, because there was a need. He ended up starting some games, and I know people will say, well, but when he started, the team was and I don't remember the record, but it was a losing record. Um, but I don't think it's all about that. He was on the right path for development, and he like when he went to City Two after after the second part of the season, he got injured and ended up not getting any more opportunities with City. But I think that's part of that mentality and that goal of developing players, and he's right there. So yeah, I think he will be back with City, and considering there will be multiple opportunities to play when you add in CONCACAF Champions Cup. Yeah, he will make some appearances and be on the bench sometimes. As far as peers, I think he will be what Caden Glover was this year, play with CD2 and maybe on occasion be on the game day roster. Maybe depending on how the game is going, he may get an opportunity either Open Cup, CONCACAF Champions, or whenever the schedule is congested. The way the way that the way it happened when Caden Glover played against Chicago Fire. It was one of those weeks where it was a congested schedule, and he ended up making his MLS debut. Then when we go to Glover, I think is also part of that next step. So he proved with CD2 that he's a good player. He scored goals. He had a good amount of minutes. So now the next step for him is to be more with the first team and take advantage of all these competitions, and he will see some minutes. I remember talking to Lutz a few weeks ago, and he was saying, yeah, with all these competitions, I know I have only 30 roster slots, so yeah, we will see more of any of the young players that are part of that 30 player roster 30 player roster. So yeah, I can see Caden Glover taking that next step, getting more minutes, and continue his path for development.
You know, as much as we talk about Lutz in his year 3 of 5, a lot of these players and these contracts are clearly setting City up for success long term, and he's putting the puzzle pieces in place. It's like the Hamilton quote. He's building a system that's going to outlive him with St. Louis, and so he's putting all the pieces into place that shore up certain positions in what you hope, as long as they live up to the hype and they come to fruition as far as their growth and development. Then you've got your striker, you have your midfielders, and you have a lot of foundations set potentially to carry the torch from where your designated players are hopefully taking you. But I guess the positions that we really haven't touched on are more in the midfield areas, right? So is that a potential area for market improvement similar to left back, where we feel like we might have our center back depth, our right back we'd probably be comfortable with. Left back, we clearly see an area of improvement. Striker, we may entirely be good with as long as Sam is re-signed. If Sam's not re-signed, I still think there is a likelihood that we stand pat, especially with Nuke B. Thorson, with Rasmus Alm in those 4-4-2s. I think there's a lot that they can offer up top just as much as they can on the left and right mids of a 4-2-3-1. Then in the midfield, I mean, you're looking at the depth that we saw this year, where you have guys like anchored by Jabulu Blom, Edu Leuven, whether it's on the left of a diamond, as a double pivot, as a 10, all over the place. You have AZ Jackson, you have Indiana Vasilev, Tomas Ostrak, Jared Stroud, Celio Pompeu. The latter two might not get re-signed. We don't know. But, you know, I look at what I'm curious, I guess, more than anything. And I'll just posit this as how Lutz might look to this. Because, yes, Chris Gebhardt mentions Leuven with his preferred number 6, double pivot next to Blom. Do you look to this as, we know that we run a 4-4-2, we know that we run a 4-2-3-1 periodically. Those are what we're comfortable with. So we need to have depth at certain spots. I'm always interested in how they approach these potential depth signings, knowing who's on the roster. Do they have a 4-4-2 depth chart written up and said we see deficiencies here? Or do they have a 4-2-3-1 that says, our left mid could use some work? I think we need a player who can really take that to the next level. And especially like a right mid, if Rasmus Alm isn't healthy, ready to go, do we need to have somebody of his caliber ready to go at right mid? Those are the conversations that are going to drive this offseason. And I guess I'm just putting thoughts out there as opposed to really taking stances on where we need specific areas of help, because our diversity in formation directly impacts our areas of deficiency, right? Because if you look at a 4-4-2, you can say that, all right, starting 11, we have Jabulu Blom, Edu Leuven, Indiana Vasilev, and AZ Jackson as our top four. Where do you improve on that? And you can improve easily, but like, where do you choose to improve? Do you improve with AZ Jackson? Do you improve with Matt Doyle? Even mentioned maybe needing to improve on Jabulu Blom. Do you improve on Indiana Vasilev? Like, the concept of choosing where to improve based on the depth charts that you have is one of the more fascinating things, and probably honestly more fascinating than the original roster construction was. And it really leads into, I guess, how you want this team to really come out of the gates next year. Do you see as the 4-4-2 the predominant formation that you build off of, and you just have enough depth to cover other types of formations? What do you think they look at when you have these kind of conversations?
Yeah, definitely that attacking mid position, especially if there could be a potential transfer for AC Jackson, and we didn't talk a lot about that, but I think the potential transfers for AC and Adeniran would be more like summer transfers.
Yeah.
But you have to start preparing for that, and as far as that being a possibility, yeah, I definitely will bring a player that can play that either that number 10 or that number 8 position, and that's where I will bring another established player, either from MLS or from another league. But yeah, if you want to compete in all these fronts, especially CONCACAF Champions League, that we know is more likely going to be a team from Mexico or another team from MLS.
Yeah.
You have to be competitive right away. It's not like hey, you may play a team from Central America that maybe you may have an easier path. And I say easier, it could still be difficult if you draw somebody from Costa Rica, Honduras, Salvador. Playing at those places is still really difficult. But but yeah, I think that's a position where I would look to bring somebody just to keep the competition, the internal competition that the team always talks about, and just preparing for a potential departure with AC.
Santi, we kind of went position by position there, which I really wasn't expecting us to do. But I think we've got everybody prepped for the off season. We went through the calendar, we went through what everything means, positions we might be looking at, different things to keep in mind. Is there anything else you want to get before we call it a show?
No, I think that's all for now, and looking forward to getting some news in the next couple of weeks. We will know who will leave, who or maybe who maybe doesn't have their options picked up, but is still in negotiations. Like, we will have more information and hopefully be able to start putting some of these pieces together.
Teams have already started making announcements who have been eliminated from the playoffs. City, we're not expecting anything until December 1st, when the club deadline to exercise those options are. So don't be surprised if we don't hear anything before Thanksgiving, but that week after Thanksgiving, there should be something to know, at least by the end of that week. And for Flyer Footy, we keep referring to the fact that we're taking a break, and Phil has done the right thing in taking a break to start, but we are going to be taking a break after this week. So we're going to take, obviously, Thanksgiving off, because we're not going to record on Thanksgiving dinner. We're all going to be stuffed with turkey and laying on our couches. But we'll do one or two more shows between the holidays. Obviously, what we talked about tonight, there's a lot that's going to happen in the next month or two. And there's a lot of roster moves that will happen. There's a CONCACAF Champions Cup draw on December 13th that we're going to be interested in. Obviously, MLS Cup Final will occur on the 9th. And there's just a lot of MLS playoffs that's going to be occurring. We'll do one or two shows between the holidays, and then after Christmas, after New Year's, we're going to get right back into it when training camp does. So bear with us on that. Enjoy yourselves around the holidays. Chris Gebhardt wants to know what's on the menu at Santi's house. Santi, close with what you usually serve and eat on Thanksgiving.
This is gonna be boring because we usually go to a friend's house. Basically, we don't have any family here. So basically, the few some of our group of friends that are in the same situation that don't have family here in St. Louis, we get together and we usually bring dessert. And maybe a side plate, but this is just the usual, like turkey, stuffing, like all the usual Thanksgiving meal. Nothing different.
So the usual American Thanksgiving, but you do a Friendsgiving.
Yeah, yeah.
Nice. Enjoy the holidays, everybody who's listening. Thank you for sticking with us. Enjoy Thanksgiving. Enjoy spending time with friends and family. And hopefully we get more city news as quickly as possible. We are clamoring for it just as much as you are. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for sticking with us. And as always, we'll talk to you later.
Vamos City.